Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, we have no guest. I'm really excited to be summarizing up this season 5 of the show. I'm a little anxious and nervous actually recording this. Something that I've learned across this journey of recording all these episodes is I, for some reason, get very nervous when I feel that someone is listening. And I've been trying to figure out why that is, because when I'm interviewing other people, even then, I'm like, okay, I hope I'm in a room where nobody can hear me. I'm always kind of bouncing between homes and different places that I'm staying. So I always try to find an area of the room or the space so that I can't be heard. But, I think there is something in overcoming that fear. And I think, I'm assuming probably a large part of that is having this deep sense of imposter syndrome. It's not necessarily clear that I don't think I belong, but I do think in a lot of ways I don't actually know what I'm saying, which is why I love playing on the role of the host, where I just get to ask questions. And I think I love the process of finding good questions to ask, letting the flow of the conversation come to you, figuring out the areas in which you want to insert a question, how you basically just get to be curious the whole time. The way I ask my questions is I just follow wherever my brain is at that moment of like, I want to know this more. So there's not so much of like a constant perception of how do I sound as I'm asking this question, because questions are quick and also they like ease my curiosity in that moment. But when you actually have to share your own ideas, I think there is this big part of like, do I actually know what I'm talking about? And even though I'm summarizing the insights of these 10 other amazing guests that we've been able to have this season, there is a part of it that, I have to pick the words to use and I have to still present what it is that I'm feeling. And so in a lot of ways, I do think that these particular episodes are where my biggest challenge and growth kind of lie. But I'm really excited to summarize season 5. I think this particular season reminded me why I love podcasting so much and what the original intention behind this whole project was. Sometimes I think it becomes very easy to forget how big of a world that we live in. It feels like everyone I know, the things that they do, the way that they think can be so similar sometimes. When you grow up in the Bay, I think there's a very similar ethos that a lot of people begin in, right? It's the belief in tech for progress. It's belief in hard work. And there's a few kind of beliefs that I think really structure the way people lead their lives. And then you leave that and you go to San Diego, and now you have a different kind of group of people, but there still again is a dominating ethos. And then I went to DC, and then I've traveled a bunch since, but what I've come to find is that there is never enough time to actually learn from every possible perspective out there. Even on season 4, when we got to dive a little bit deeper into the Puerto Rican experience, I feel that there was so much that I was able to learn through that, from understanding what were some of the biggest issues that colonial influences had on the people of Puerto Rico, and how did that then trickle down into their education? What was it like being a territory? What was their kind of challenges with that politically, dealing with the ramifications of a lot of these feeling alienated and second-class citizens in a lot of ways? And I think we were only able to speak with maybe 5 people, I believe, with 7 episodes total, but it offered this new perspective into understanding education and people. The same thing happened when we spoke to the people from India and worked with all the organizations there. But yet it always feels like at the end of the day, there are just never enough puzzle pieces to put the whole thing together. And so I've been coming up with all these lavish ideas of how I want my kind of life to pan out, and being able to collect as many of these perspectives as possible, and trying. I think there is the perspective of what is it like to live in this world with disabilities, any number of them. What is it like to be deaf? What is it like to be blind? How do you view the world? What is it like for you? What is it like to be a child prodigy? What is it like to be living in the Congo, or living in Somalia, or living in Japan or Taiwan or Australia? What is it like to have lived 80 years ago versus what is it like to live 30 years from now? What is it like to be a youth in today's day and age versus, all these comparisons? You can always compare people's perspectives and experiences across time, across space, culture, religion, because I think what ends up becoming clear is that each person, and I think this is actually, if I was to connect this before we get into the season, is that one of my core educational beliefs is this: each person, when it comes to understanding the plight of humanity, has a very important and unique perspective into answering that question, right? And the questions can be from a list of why are we here? What does it mean to be human? Why do we suffer? Any of these. There is no one group who will have the answer or have access to that answer, because any one group will lack the perspective of other people who are not in that group, and therefore cannot speak to what it means to be human because it's from one perspective. And so in that sense, I think every person, based on their unique lived experiences, which no two people are the same in that sense, has a key to this understanding. So I think being able to find value within yourself for that particular reason is really important, and in an aspect of education that I think should be more focused on. So let's get into the season. So I mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to kind of first start by saying this because there was a part in a recent episode where I actually made a slip that I felt bad for. And I think even as I remember how I started this particular season, I'm realizing how my ignorance played in so many different ways in the conversations that I was having. There was a conversation a few episodes ago in which I was speaking to someone from Hawaii, and I accidentally, in the flow of the conversation in the beginning, I was really excited to get into the conversation, and I made a slip. I removed it from the episode, but I wanted to talk about it. I had asked, do you surf? And I think, I saw the guest's face shift a little bit, and it took some time for me to reflect. I immediately knew in that moment that, even though my intention wasn't to say something harmful or hurtful, I understood how perhaps I understood the mistake that I made in that particular situation. It's interesting because an episode from earlier, I think episode 2 or 3, we were talking about political correctness, and, I was talking about, it's hard sometimes to be politically correct. And the guest had kind of, corrected that in some ways and said, it doesn't have to be politically correct. It can just be correct. Where I think there's something really interesting about that, which is when we think about this concept of being PC, it seems like modulating what we want to say or how we think, just so we can fit into some abstract concept of what it means to be good at that particular given time and context. But correctness in other ways is simply an understanding of the experience of whoever it is you're talking to be more aware and sensitive of what is acceptable and what is not. So connecting back to this question that I had asked, I really sat on it for a few days after, because I was like, why did I say that? And what does that really show about myself and my awareness of what is it actually like to be Hawaiian? Because I think that's the key part of what I missed. And we talked about this in the Puerto Rico season. We also talked about this in the India season, which is the unawareness of a lot of people who do tourism and who travel to these countries. Because I've been to Hawaii multiple times, and I, stayed there for a month and, worked remotely from there, and in a lot of ways caused a lot of the issues that our guests spoke about with Airbnbs and kind of how difficult it's made for people to find housing in Hawaii. But I didn't actually spend enough time with Indigenous people to understand how a simple question like, do you surf, could actually be playing on so many kind of subtle messaging about what people who don't live there think about what people there do. there's actually nothing wrong in the essence of asking that question in isolation of, let's say we've had a whole conversation. What are your hobbies? Do you like surfing? That's different. But to start the conversation off, before I even really understood the guest, knew who he was, knew what he came from, what he's been through, to somehow ask that question, I now realize how wrong that is. And I think that is the beauty of perspective, is that the more you understand people, the more you understand why someone might find that offensive. It's not just like, oh, like really, I don't even know if the guest did find offensive. It was never mentioned, but it is the idea that perhaps what I'm saying is it is placed inside of a context where it may not necessarily be accepted in that same way. I kind of had to like connect it back to myself being Indian. I'm like, what is a question someone could have asked me where off the bat it would have just been like, that doesn't seem right, asking something like, do you like curry as the first question, or do you, I don't know, own a 7-Eleven gas station? Off the bat would have just been like, I think Indians stand for a little bit more than that. But I think like I wanted to really highlight that, one, for a few reasons. One, I want to address from the get-go that I am so far from perfect and have made so many mistakes and continue to make so many mistakes. But I want to do my absolute best to be honest about them, because I think a lot of this kind of cancel culture world that we've built is built on people who are constantly trying to hide their worst impulses and thoughts. And I think accepting that I'm not perfect and we all make mistakes, and I, at this particular moment, there was a level of ignorance and a lack of understanding of place and context which caused me to ask a question like that. And I think moving forward, I want to keep being honest and always addressing the places where I make mistakes and how I can be better about that. But I think this is why this season was so important for me, because I'd mentioned it earlier in episode 2, I believe, where I was like, the only exposure I've had in my education to Indigenous people is through watching the movie Pocahontas and by the kind of victim narrative that was always placed around being Indigenous. We never actually learned deeply about what all the beautiful aspects of different Indigenous groups of people were. We didn't learn about the people, I think, where I grew up. It was the Ohlone tribe, I believe. But, we didn't learn about those particular people's practices and cultures. We didn't understand the nuances. And Indigenous was just one group of people. Somehow they existed all over the country, and they were all very homogenous. And it was taught as if there was some other group that like just existed here, and then now they're not. And we don't really want to talk about the actual detail and the pain of any of that, but we're just gonna, just understand that happened. But you don't have to actually feel it or really understand what it means. And so there's always this deep disconnection between the people who originally lived here and the people who colonized. And I guess what that ends up doing is you start to form like caricatures of these people from media, from film, from books, that aren't the actual people who've endured or experienced that. And I think about this all the time in so much of my education, where I think when your education is primarily bookish, what ends up happening is you just create models of everything that you read about. But when your education is actually experienced, you no longer have these abstract models. You have real people that you think about when you read particular texts. So when you read about some of the most brutal travesties, you're not just like, oh, that happened to some abstract group of people, that's terrible. You know people. You're like, oh, that probably happened to my friend's great-great-grandfather. Or, I know someone who was pushed into a reservation, so on and so forth. It becomes so much more real. And I think this process of becoming something that's abstract to real is what causes a person to feel empathy, to understand the world, to understand suffering, to understand progress. It cannot simply be, hey, people couldn't vote, and then in 1920 they were able to vote, and then yay, now they can vote. Like you have to in some way be able to embody what it was like to not be able to vote, to not be able to have a certain space in the room, to be treated as less than. And only through that can you then understand, oh, this is something that didn't just happen in the past, but is happening all the time. What is it that causes people to colonize others, whether it's through their actions, whether it's through their beliefs, whether it's through, who else knows what are all the other ways to colonize a group? But it happens all over the world. And so to understand that, okay, these things that we're talking about did not just happen to some abstract group in the past, it can happen to anyone and is happening today, causes a relationship to these concepts and ideas to no longer just be abstract. They become very real, and there's things that it becomes evident why you have to understand and process them in the moment and context of the time and place that you live in. So that being said, once I realized, okay, my understanding of these group of people is completely from these, actually I would maybe even say very inaccurate depictions, I needed to first build up a new definition then. What did it actually mean to be Indigenous? And the first thing I noticed is when I was talking to people from New Zealand or Canada, the United States, I was like, these are completely different land masses. I mean, there's no way that these people could have been that similar when they had never interacted with each other. So this concept of indigeneity cannot be like just one thing. There is no just one form of indigenous. So my main big question is, what were the underlying principles and beliefs that connected indigenous people, that separated them from those who colonized? And I think there were three things that I found that I wanted to touch on. So the first one is people's relationship to space. So the space that someone lives in. Someone actually talked about this earlier, and I'm actually not 100% sure whether this stat is correct, but I heard it and I'm going to throw it out. I heard that the average American moves 6 times throughout their life. And that could even be within the same town, but moving across town, whatever. 6 times is a lot. That means your brain has to now create a new relationship with a new place 6 different times. And then when you compound this for your child, then then it increases more and more to where in 3 or 4 generations, your great-great-grandkids probably have no idea of the space that their great-grandpa lived in. And so what actually does that do? I was thinking a lot about this from being the child of immigrants who, my family, primarily their hometown is this small village called Devakote. And my great-great-grandparents for a long time have resided there. And eventually for jobs, people have moved out and then extending all the way to where my dad moved to the U.S. And in the U.S., he's moved twice and 3 times, and I've moved a bunch. And I've been thinking about, in this season, a lot of how I have no idea how, where, and when, like, my great-great-grandparents lived. Like, I don't actually know the home that they lived in, what they did on a day-to-day basis, what they wore, how they talked to people. I know none of it. And there's a few reasons for this. One is I can't imagine it, because obviously there's the limitation of time. So you can't really understand what people lived like 100 years ago. But if you were to live in the same spaces that they lived in, you knew which schools that they went to, you knew where they ate and who they ate with, and maybe you knew other people who were alive back then who could tell you about them. Stories have a really strong way of passing forward. Small memorabilia, things have a way of passing forward to where somehow or some way you'll be able to recollect things about them when the whole community as a whole keeps staying in the same space. When you don't have that, there is no interconnection with like what is happening in a particular place. And so one of the things that was talked about a lot in this season is that when you have that generational kind of connection to the land, you actually have deep embodied knowledge about the spaces around you that when you move so much, you just don't. It's knowing all the smallest things about a place, which I don't even know. I don't even have the capacity to tell you what those things are, right? I mean, I've never experienced that. So I can't tell you, what my brain would have thought of if I lived in the same place that my family has lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But I'm assuming it would have to do with having a deep understanding of when things are going wrong, when things are going right, having that intuition of, okay, these birds or the water doesn't taste right. Okay, maybe the wind has been a little different recently. Why is that? And having, I can't even, I'm just postulating. I have no idea. But there is that deep connection to the land that makes a person feel so grounded that I don't even know if I've ever felt the concept of home. Right? I mean, I've experienced it, and actually I think I have a very unique sense of home because I move around so much. I feel that I'm able to call a place home within the span of 12 hours, right? Like first day, I'm like, okay, this is weird. Second day, home. Let's go home, right? But that idea to like know what is home, to follow that kind of quiet voice within your soul, if you believe in that calls you to come somewhere, to stay somewhere, right? I mean, it's something that I'm not really sure I know what it is. And so I think one of the first main things that was talked about, similarity between the Indigenous experience, is this deep-rooted connection to space. So next, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the next thing that seemed to be very similar between all Indigenous people is their connection to their ancestors. This was talked about so many times, elders, ancestors, about a deep connection to those who came before us. This is something, again, I briefly touched on the last time, where I was like, I have no idea, where my grandparents lived or like what they did or anything about them really, except for a few stories that my parents have told me. In that sense, I have felt very disconnected from all the lineage that I have had, right? I mean, for the tens of thousands of years of reproduction that had to happen in the exact way they did for me to be alive. I am completely out of touch with that. So I've been thinking a lot about what impact that actually ends up having on a person. I think when you're not deeply connected to your ancestors, what ends up happening is you can kind of get lost in this world of narcissistic beliefs about yourself, where you're like, I just popped up. I just ended up, my parents fell in love and then they reproduced and then I'm here. That's it. It's just all me. I did it by myself and my parents did it, and it's like, what ends up happening, I think you start to feel like you're at the center. That all of these things before you didn't have to happen, and it was actually just one or two decisions and then boom, you're alive. But I think what this kind of deep understanding of ancestors can do, and again postulating because I don't know, is that makes you, so being connected to the space makes you grounded where you are. Being connected with your ancestors makes you grounded in the context that you are, right? The time that you are. Because it makes you realize the long lineage of which you are simply just another part. You are not the main part. You are not the only part. You are simply another node of this infinitely long chain that has existed for so many years before you. Your mind would explode if you actually had to comprehend how many generations have come before you. And in that sense, I think it makes you really understand your place in the world. Right, by understanding, okay, and that's the same thing with the space, right? Understanding how much a city or not even the land that you've been on has transformed over the years makes you kind of understand your place in that. And it's one of the interesting things that I think a lot about when it comes to nihilism versus the opposite of just endless optimism for meaning, is that I think the hardest part about being a human is balancing the two. Understanding that you are simply just one of many, and also understanding that you are a very unique being that will never exist again. Both are equally true. Your meaninglessness and your uniqueness are both true. And so in the same way, understanding that there is this huge lineage of people before you does not make it so that you don't matter just because there's been so many people. But because it also places the importance of each one of those people in taking care of the land, taking care of the people, and in being able to allow so many other people to exist just because of them. And so the decisions that you make are very important, but also at the same time, you're not the only one making important decisions. So is everyone. And so is every animal, and ant, and rock maybe, but they don't make decisions, they just roll. But in this way, I think this deep interconnection to those before you can cause this grounding in the time and context and your role as a human. So in connection with time and space, the next thing I wanted to talk about is that I really resonated with what a lot of people were sharing about what is fundamental to being Indigenous, is the shared connection that people felt to the earth as a whole. There was this one really beautiful example where one of our guests was talking about the fact that there wasn't really a word in their language for ditch. And they were talking about ditches in regards to agriculture. And they were talking how a ditch, what it works is it leads water to the farms, but it doesn't actually have a system to then dispose or to like bring the water back into the cycle. And he was talking a lot about how so much of what ends up happening on this earth is simply because of that we think often of how to make use of things, but we don't think of how to actually sustain or regenerate the same thing that we just used. And the reason I think sometimes can do this, and it's very deeply connected to the last two things that we talked about. One, when you feel like you are not really connected to the space you're in, and I think, my dad has talked to me about this a lot, of just coming here as an immigrant. For the first few years and maybe even decade that he was here, he used to tell me that he never really felt like he had a responsibility to take care of this country, right? He was like, okay, I'm here. I needed opportunities. They're giving me all these resources. I'm going to take my best use case of it and then go back home. And it was only after that kind of dream or that belief eventually subsided that he felt a little bit more of a connection to the space that he was occupying now. But I think that if you're constantly moving and you have no connection to the people before you, you start to lose the sense of responsibility that you have for the people who come after you. Because you're like, I just appeared here. Why do I need to care about the people after me? But when you're aware of that lineage, you realize that there is a far greater number of people to come after you than have come before you. And so if you ruin the planet, if you ruin the resources that people have for so long taken proper care of, then like that would just be a terrible amount of just like guilt to have to deal with. And so I feel like most people just would not even be driven to act in such a selfish way because they understand the relationship in which all the things around us are interconnected, and how if one part of that gets destroyed or diluted or polluted, then it makes it difficult for all the people who come after us. So this sense of relationship and understanding of the land and of earth is something that was talked about multiple times in this season, and its impact of how many people who are working with climate change and who are working with environmental issues are now reaching out to a lot of Indigenous people to learn from them of how do we go backwards in a lot of the harm that we've done to the earth. How do we change the way we even think about this? A few guests voiced their belief that it starts fundamentally with our relationship with the earth. How do we even think about the earth? Do we think about it as a resource that we need to use so that we can keep creating and generating things, or do we think about it as a partner? Right? I mean, this was one of the really interesting philosophical things about humans' relationship with nature. How do we view, first of all, what is nature? Secondly, how do we view our relationship with this nature? Do we look at it kind of like antagonistically? These tornadoes and hurricanes are always trying to kill us. These earthquakes are trying to kill us. These bears, I hate nature. Or do we look at it as like a partner through which there is so much beauty and so much kind of value that it offers and protection that it offers us, but at the same time also has uncertainty and danger, but it is the character of nature. It's not, let's get rid of all the danger and keep only the positive. It's not so much to kind of control and change it, but it's more of like a deep understanding of it, the ups, the flows, and the tides of it, the good and the bad. So I think this was a particular part that made me just sit back and think a lot about what is my relationship with the earth, right? I mean, it runs so much deeper than just do you recycle. It is, do you recycle because you feel connected with the earth, not because do you recycle because you think it makes you a good person, right? And I think that's the difference, that when you feel connected with the earth, whatever that means and whatever that looks like, and I think I'll get to that next, but when you feel connected with the earth, I think your actions will naturally manifest in such a way that it's beneficial for it. And it has nothing to do with, oh, this will make me a good person. So I think to summarize these last 3 points, these three I think were some of the most foundational things I heard this season on what it meant to be Indigenous. It wasn't a look, it wasn't a clothing style, it wasn't how you talked or dressed. It was a deep connection to space, time, and the earth. So when connecting these three things, I want to now talk a little bit about knowledge or education as a whole. Even earlier when I was speaking about this word earth, one thing that I think is interesting is that thought or that word definitely evokes a different emotion and a different understanding for each person, right? Earth means so many different things. For some people, earth could just mean their country, or it could just mean the land that they have seen. Or for some people, if you've flown on a plane and you've had that beautiful experience of a third person vision of the earth at that level, that looks like something. Someone who traveled to the moon, earth probably looks very different. Or if you interact with a lot of images of the earth from all these telescopes, maybe, or what is it, like the Hubble? No, Hubble is a telescope, so it would be like one of those rovers that's like gone out into the, one of my students would know this, he knows every single space thing possible, I should ask him. But one of those, like an image of earth from that perspective, would have you think about earth very differently. So the word earth evokes a different sense and a different experience for each individual. When it came to knowledge, this was something that was talked a lot about in this last season. The knowledge is not simply just, do you know how long polar bears live? Or how fast does the speed of light travel? Or how far is the sun from Earth? Or what happens when two nucleuses interact with each other? Do nucleuses interact with each other? Maybe. But it's that each one of these pieces of knowledge is deeply embodied and also experienced. It is not so much simply what is it that you know, but also what does what you know feel and how does it impact the way you go about your life? And I think this is a really, really key aspect that I think is fundamentally missing in Western approaches to learning. It often focuses so much on what is true that it completely does not care really about how what you know impacts the way that you feel and how you navigate the world. So I have an experience that actually when I was recording, so I recorded most of this season within the span of 3-4 days. So I was really kind of in the world of what it meant to be Indigenous in those 4 days that I was recording these conversations. And I had this weird experience. I was in DC and I was on a walk on a balcony. I was just walking back and forth and I was thinking, and this wind had really hit me. So I recently, to share a little bit about myself, recently I've been in a space of feeling very disconnected with myself and insecure about my plans for the future. And I had this experience where this wind hit me and it felt for a brief moment like the future version of Goutham was putting his hand on my shoulder and saying, it'll all work out. Don't worry about it. And I'd never had that experience before. It was very unique. And I know it sounds, it really is what it felt like in that moment. And I just remembered at that moment of like, okay, if I was to speak to the younger version of myself now, what would I tell him? And in that same way, I was like, that version of me would have never heard that because I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't like looking for it. So I never would have been like, oh, that gust of wind was my future self talking to me. Or, oh, that star twinkling at me is a future version of me winking at me, right? I wasn't looking for those kind of messages in the world around me. So I would have never seen them. And so when it happened this time in DC, what rushed over me was a deep sense of, okay, it's okay. You got this. You're going on the right path. Keep going. Don't give up. Whether we can study whether the wind actually can carry messages. Obviously, a physics person would say that it's impossible for someone who lives 30, 40 years down the road to communicate with me through wind. Yes, that is all true. But the experience of that moment felt so real that it directly impacted what I did for the rest of that day and the next day and the next. And so how does it matter how true it is? But this is not to say that truth doesn't matter. It's just to say that there is so much more to knowledge than simply just, is it true or is it false? I think that was something that was really cool to kind of talk about this time, where this experience of knowledge is something that can be embodied, and also knowledge is something that can be experienced. I felt a lot more of a holistic way to view knowledge. Another aspect of this knowledge that was touched heavily upon was the importance of language. So again, here I have another personal anecdote that I wanted to touch on. I think growing up, my parents always wanted me to speak the language my mother tongue, which is Tamil. It's the oldest South Indian language, oldest language, I believe, that's still spoken today, but it's spoken primarily in Tamil Nadu in South India. And it was something that was always pushed on me of like, don't let the language die, you should speak it. And a lot of Tamil people feel very proud of their language. And growing up, the question for me is like, why? Outside of this feeling of, nationalism towards a language, I don't know what the word for feeling that amount of patriotism for a language is, but outside of feeling kind of that patriotic for your language, what is actually the value of learning the language if I can't speak to anyone with it? I can't speak to people I meet. I can't really even travel that much with the language. From a purely utilitarian perspective, it never made sense to me why it was so important to learn that language. But during this season, I think my opinion has changed on that. A lot of importance was talked about in these last 10 episodes on the importance of learning your ancestors' tongue. And one of the reasons that really stuck with me is that is the only way in which you'll be able to communicate with them. It's not only communicate with them in the kind of physical sense, but also just being able to, as we talked about in the previous section, let's say hypothetically, I believe that I can actually speak to my ancestors. When I'm really lost for answers, let's just say hypothetically, I believe that if I look up at the stars and speak to my ancestors, I can hear their answer back. And it could be through the wind, it could be through the vibrations of the earth, whatever. This idea that my ancestors did not know English, that they could not understand it, and they could not understand a single thing that I'm saying, means that it is only by learning my language can I actually speak in the tongue that they understood and were able to communicate in. So I never actually took it in this perspective of like, maybe if I learn Tamil, I'll actually be able to have so much clarity in the things that I do because I'll be able to actually listen and understand to my ancestors. And this obviously can be brought down to the level of, okay, well, obviously you can speak to your grandparents in this language or so on and so forth. But I thought this kind of more longer lineage of people that I'm being, missing out on the opportunity of speaking or connecting with, to me was a really beautiful way of giving me a new reason to want to learn my language that I think no utilitarian perspective could really hit. So I'm excited. I've actually recently been learning Japanese, but once that is done, I am really excited I think I now have the motivation to fully go back and learn Tamil very well. And so again, whether it's true or not that I'll be able to speak with my ancestors, I do feel like that has now influenced my behavior to go learn a language. Moving on, I think one of the other things that was talked about so much in this season was the influence of colonialism and capitalism on modernity, Indigenous thought, modern Indigenous thought. And I wanted to kind of talk a lot about colonialism and just like from my experience, what it has been, and then I wanted to also touch a little bit more on what a lot of the messages that we learned this season was. So again, connecting back to my Indian background, I think I've learned a lot about the impacts colonialism has by viewing and observing my family who still lives in India. So one of the main things that we talked a lot about was, what is the foundational philosophy behind colonial thought? And all of our conversations seem to surround this concept of control, the desire for control of others, what they do, what they think, what they're allowed to, pursue on their free time, every aspect of their life, to control it so that it benefits you, right? Again, connecting back to what we were talking about earlier, not understanding the interconnectedness of us all, right? Which causes us to look at someone else and be like, you are less than. I want you to actually do something for me, or I want to take all your resources and then just leave you dry. Not actually understanding how that can impact not only them, but also yourself in that process of destroying whatever makes you human. So there was two parts that first came to me. So one is understanding how my family thinks about the world. I understand how much fear they have towards others and towards freedom and towards like kindness and love. And a lot of that comes from the direct impact of the English colonization of India for many, many years. I actually just came across a stat that, and the approximations have a lot of variance in it, but between 80 to 180 million Indians were killed in the span of 40 years during the peak of the English colonization process. That is insane. That is absolutely insane. And that same number can be shown similarly to the amount of indigenous people that were killed in North America. And what it shows is this deep sense of feeling like this other group of people are inferior for whatever reason it is that you want to come up with. But it is also important to note that once a colonizing agent leaves the place that they were colonizing, the beliefs don't simply just disappear immediately. They become so entrenched that is something that you carry with for many, many years until you directly address them. So the amount of colorism that exists in India, the power hierarchies that are that are so strong, I feel like have all been kind of passed forward by this legacy of colonialism. And so in understanding the structures of the North, I think there are two aspects in which you have to first follow to understand how we got to where we are today. And I think before I used to always think it was so much of capitalism that kind of formed many of our beliefs on what is right, what is wrong, and how to lead our lives. I'm now realizing so does the philosophy that has originated from colonialism. And so I think it was really cool to talk a lot about what is colonialism, and on the other hand, what is decolonialism? What does it look like to heal from the trauma that has been caused from this? And this is another reason one of the guests talked about the value and importance of learning language. It is a direct action of decolonialism, where so many years people have told you your language is less than, don't speak this. It is a direct act against that to then go, no, I am going to learn it and I'm going to speak it as much as possible. And that also exists in wearing your cultural clothing. That exists in, practicing the traditions that your culture did, to speak, to be bold in what it is that you were before these kind of agents that made you look poorly on it, right? I mean, I remember a huge kind of example of this is how the beard is now looked so down upon in South India, which never made sense to me because everyone grows hair naturally. And so looking into the history a little bit, it was really fascinating to see how that also came from a lot of the people who came from the UK, as they weren't growing beards. And so they kind of pushed that belief onto so many people, and now it's something that the whole country runs with, or a lot of the country runs with. And so in this way, I think a lot of these actions, sometimes when you understand that's the root of where it came from, that's why I may have thought my food was smelly when I was young, or that's why I may have thought I looked ugly for my skin color or for the way I smelled or whatever. It is a direct act to then go against that and say, I no longer am going to succumb to the pressures that you put on me, and I will stand by whatever it is that my culture is. And in another kind of note on this same thing, something that we talked a lot about was not simply doing this process of decolonializing the mind simply through rage or anger, but from a place of love towards those who have oppressed. I think that was another beautiful part that we've talked about in a lot of these conversations, where it's simply, if your actions are simply motivated from a place of rage, it looks like these similar processes of oppression continue to cycle. It is only through forgiving those who are oppressed will it hopefully eventually stop. I think that was a really beautiful message that a few guests voiced, and is something that I want to keep close to my heart as I continue to heal from a lot of the different things that, have happened, and to not kind of approach it from a place of anger, but to really see that the people who were hurting also, were going through their own things, and were working within a system that they may not have really understood at that time. I can't believe it's been more than 40 minutes already, but I wanted to conclude by saying this season was one of the most beautiful recordings I've done. I think what I learned a lot is when I look back to each individual episode, maybe there were 1 or 2 points, but across the entire season, I can now see how much speaking to these amazing people has changed my mind in all these fundamental ways of my relationship to knowledge, understanding my connection to the earth, to people before me, and to space, understanding how knowledge can be embodied, understanding the importance of my language, and looking more critically at tourism and finding connections that, maybe someone tells you that shouldn't be there, but being able to find the interconnectedness of everything that is on this earth, thinking about the importance of flow rather than just like directing the use of resources so that I can achieve something. How do I make sure that it goes back and that it is in a regenerative way? I think this season taught me so much, and I'm just so grateful to be able to have spoken with such a wide-ranging group of people from 5 countries, I believe, and it was just, I'm really appreciative. I'm just, even as I record this episode, I'm having a moment of just sitting back, and I'm sitting in New York at my friend's house, and I'm having a deep sense of appreciation for how this podcast has been going, the direction that it's going to continue going in, and how many conversations there are left to be had as long as I'm alive. And I'm excited to continue Re-Educated forever, and hopefully pass it down one day to someone else who's interested in continuing these conversations. But I wanted to really take this time to say a deep thank you to all of you for supporting and for being there, whether it is as a guest, as a listener. Truly, maybe you're just hopping in, this is your first episode. Regardless of what it is, I want to say thank you. I really do think if we continue to have these conversations and connect with each other and gain ideas and perspectives from all of us, I think we can really move society towards a place that we can all think is better. But I hope you guys are all having a lovely week. Thank you for listening. And as per usual, stay re-educated.